Hello. The Divine Code for July 21st, pages 87 and 88. On the chapter, Torah Study for Gentiles. Continuing in Halakha number 2. The general rule is that it is obligatory for a Gentile to learn the 7 commandments, what he is commanded to do. And he should learn them very well to know what is permitted and prohibited for him. He is permitted to learn them even in a way of delving into them, meaning deeply learning to understand the reasons and the details within the Noahide Code. So for studying the Noahide Code, a non-Jew is obligated. A non-Jew is required to learn the basics of the Noahide Code, and that would be such as what's available in the Divine Code or other similar books, to learn what is required of the non-Jew. Learning the details, the underlying rationale, is permitted for a non-Jew. It's not required, but it's permitted to learn, and it's probably a good idea to know why we're doing what we're doing. Instead, but if a person feels comfortable just knowing the details without knowing the reasons for them, that's sufficient. But if he wants to go further into it, he of course is allowed to. But in regard to the rest of the commandments of the Torah, that is the Jewish commandments, he is allowed to learn about them for the sake of understanding them, whether from the text of the written Torah or the oral Torah, but not in a way of in-depth learning and penetrative investigative learning, pilpul, which is the Jewish style of learning Talmud. Rather, a Gentile is permitted to learn from books in a language he understands on topics that are written in a concise and clear way. An example would be the proper translation of the text of the Mishnah Torah by Rambam, which presents Torah law decisions, but not the inner reasons and details of how the derived rulings are decided by the sages, including the Rambam himself. So this is the two basic levels of Torah study. There's lots of more details to the different levels of Torah study, but the basic level the basic two types of Torah study. One is on a very basic level, just knowing the facts. What is a person allowed to do? What is a person not allowed to do? That's the basic level of Torah study, and that is obligatory for a non-Jew to learn those parts that apply to the non-Jew. To know what applies to oneself, it's necessary to know these things. The reasoning behind it is the deeper pilpul, the investigative, the in-depth analysis of Torah. If it is something that applies to the non-Jew, if it's part of his 7 laws, or in the broad sense, then the non-Jew is able to study. If it is not applied to the non-Jew, then the non-Jew should not be studying those areas of Torah in that in-depth manner. Now, there could be questions as to what applies to the non-Jew. There's so many details, and each Torah law goes into once you start digging deep into it, you find that it connects with so many other Torah laws. They're not individual capsules that you study one thing, you're just studying that one thing. It goes off into many different directions. So how that works is something that has to be learned. How that works, and a non-Jew needs to interact with a rabbi, as is explained a little bit further on in this halakha. But for right now, footnote 107, it's a long footnote. See the Shulchan Aruch Harav, Laws of Torah Study, Chapter 2, in Kutris Akron 1, that Rambam, okay, so these are in-depth books. Shulchan Aruch Harav is an in-depth book, but because we're learning the rules of Torah study, we're learning halakas that apply to the non-Jew, and therefore it's proper to go in depth. Therefore, we're looking at the Shulchan Aruch in this subject. Rambam wrote Mishnah Torah as a practical Torah guide, and his opinion is that from learning his Mishnah Torah, his is the Rambam. The Rambam's opinion is that by learning his Mishnah Torah, one could know the final Torah laws without the reasons. Now there's different. That's the way the Rambam wrote it. Now there's other books that also would give like a final ruling, and sometimes they're a little different from the other books. So that they don't all agree, but that's the idea. The Rambam wrote his book with the purpose of saying, okay, this is the halakha. This is what is right and what is not right to do. And he did it in a very basic manner without giving the explanations. And people criticized him because he didn't give the explanations. And so a lot of commentary has been written on those explanations. The commentary, I guess, would fit into the second category of Torah study, whereas the text itself, the Mishnah Torah text itself, would be in the first area of Torah study, the basic area. In the Shulchan Aruch Harav, it explains the statement by the sages that the Jewish person should divide his time for Torah study into thirds, 3 parts: written Torah, that is the Hebrew Bible, Mishnah, and Gemara. Then it explains that Mishnah is the general term. As a general term, includes any part of the oral Torah which is recorded for the sake of basic knowledge. This includes those texts that present the opinions of established Torah sages on Torah laws in brief, without their explanations, like the Mishnah Torah, Torah, and Shulchan Aruch. So those are other books that give the basic study, the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, or some of the other books. They give a basic explanation of the mitzvahs, of the halakhas. However, those sources that explain the reasons for the Torah laws, such as the Rosh and the Beit Yosef, and those texts that explain the details of the Shulchan Aruch, are considered to be within the part of Torah that is called Gemara as a general term, which includes the Talmud, Midrash, and Zohar. According to this categorization, we can explain that anything that is written that is within the part of the Torah called Mishnah is permitted for a pious Gentile to learn. because he is not delving into Torah. Rather, he is just learning the text that teaches about Torah law without its depth and reasons, as can be found in specific classic works, including Rambam's Mishnah Torah, Rabbi Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch, and certainly the Kitzer, abridged Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Shlomo Gatzfried, and likewise the tractates of Mishnah itself by Rabbi Yehuda the Prince without its subsequent exclamations. So there's very basic study, and then there's books that are written that go beyond an exclamation, explaining what the basic books teach. So in the areas that apply to the Noahide may study these deeper areas. In the areas that do not apply to the Noahide should not be studying it. Now, then the question comes into play: what applies to the Noahide? And that can, because one thing leads to another, and you start in one area of Torah study, you wind up way off in another area, because that's how the study works. That's how the Torah functions. The Torah is all interconnected. So it becomes difficult to create clear boxes as to this is what this area of the non-Jew is allowed to study in depth, and this area of the non-Jew is not allowed to study in depth. Once you start studying one area in depth, it's going to connect out into a much broader area, and that's why the Gemara and the Talmud, you wind up with discussions that go all over the place, because that's just how it works. However, the exclamations of the Mishnah, such as those of Rabbi Obadiah Bartanura, are considered part of Gemara, as is explained in Likutei Sikot, volume 36, page 17, because they explain the reasons and depth of the Mishnah. But the Talmud itself and the books of those codifiers who write in depth about the reasoning of the Torah laws, such as the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Aruch Hashlukim, and the Mishnah Berurah, are definitely forbidden for Gentiles to learn, because this is called delving into Torah. Something we discovered when a class studying the Noahide laws, it was discovered that there are things within the Shulchan Aruch, with the set table, that explain non-Jewish interaction, the interactions between Jews and non-Jews on Shabbos. In fact, a large amount of the Shulchan Aruch's text, halakkas, for the Jew on Shabbos is how he interacts with the non-Jew on Shabbos. Can he send a post on Friday? Can he post a letter on Friday that'll be delivered on Sunday, meaning that somebody is working, a non-Jew is working on Shabbos, mailing a Jew's letter, delivering a Jew's letter? Is it permitted for the Jew to send the post on Friday? This affects the non-Jew because it tells the non-Jew can read this and say, well, what am I allowed to do? Am I allowed to deliver a Jew's letter, or can I ship a Jew's letter across town for delivery? It's picked up before Shabbos, it's delivered after Shabbos. Can a non-Jew transport the letter on Shabbos on behalf of the Jew? So these are questions that exist throughout the halakha, the books of halakha. So in our class, we're looking at the non-Jew interacting with the Jew on Shabbos. What is he allowed to do? What is he not allowed to do? And this goes in as a result. Our class is studying the deeper understandings, not only the basic understandings, but the deeper understandings of these laws. But they apply to the non-Jew. But it's laws of Shabbos. And this is where the application of these rules concerning Torah study, the application becomes, we need to be able to clearly define what the rules are. And I'm not sure if the rules can be that we're putting certain areas of halakha into boxes. This box you're allowed to study, and this box you're not allowed to study, but rather it's a methodology that needs to be developed. If you're studying in this manner, this is what you can do and what you're not allowed to do. It's more of a methodology rather than a checking off areas of a table of contents. And this is what needs to be developed in a more fuller manner. But the Talmud itself, the books of the Torah fighters who write in depth about the reasoning of the Torah laws, the Shulchan Aruch, are definitely forbidden for Gentiles to read because this is called delving into the Torah. So that would be in the areas that don't apply to the non-Jew. Delving in those areas would be forbidden. This categorization is defined in Responsa Makana Chaim, Volume 1, Chapter 7. If the Gentile does not understand what is permissible for him, he should ask an observant Jewish Torah scholar to explain it to him. So if you're not sure about a text or not sure about a certain type of Torah study or a certain area of Torah study, you should be asked. It's important for anybody who's involved in these things to be connected with a rabbi, someone, not just somebody you read a rabbi's book and think you're connected to him and you're following him. No, you actually have to have it. It's very important to develop a real connection. Someone who knows your name. And you interact, go back and forth and interact to ask questions of this type. Because this stuff is beyond something you can just read in a few pages in a book. So it's necessary to be interacting with a rabbi, to have someone that you can ask, and this is you have a specific rabbi that person you're going to listen to, and there's a trust there that's developed, and not all of these relationships. You got to find the rabbi that you can interact with, not necessarily the one that gives you the answers you want to hear, but have a rabbi that you interact with that will be able to deal with these kinds of questions, and someone that will take the time to listen and take the time to explain. Therefore, if one does not understand a point in any text that he may read or study that is mentioned in this chapter, he is permitted to ask a reliable and observant Jewish Torah scholar to explain it to him. It appears that it is permissible for a Jew to teach a Gentile a single Torah laws that he asks about, or to answer a question in a specific area of Torah without explaining the depth and reasons involved. See response of Rambam, Biar Ador, chapter 60. So, yeah, there's many gradations in the subjects, in the types of Torah that can be learned. On one hand, you have areas that are the Noahide mitzvahs, where there are the Noahide halakhic areas that apply to the non-Jew. That the non-Jew is required to study on a basic level and is permitted to study in an in-depth level. And then there's the areas that are basically the Jewish halakas, the Jewish laws. In that area, the non-Jew can learn on a basic level, but not in the in-depth level. And the in between, you have areas, for example, you have areas that are obligatory moral conduct, which are things that they're not necessarily halakas, but they're things that we should do, like being nice to people, things that we should do. So that's an area of study that is not quite a Noahide commandment, but it's definitely within the area of a Noahide. And then there's areas of Torah that we're allowed to take on certain mitzvahs that they're not obligatory. Like being nice to people would be obligatory. But let's say shooing away the mother bird is an example given as something we're allowed to do. We don't have to do, but we're allowed to do. So that's an area, it's recommended that we do. That would be another gradation. And then there is the purely voluntary mitzvot that a person might do, but there's not a clear benefit, but there's still benefit. Some people take on kosher, which animals they will eat, because they hear that a person who eats kosher animals will become more of a refined person, and a person who eats non-kosher animals will become more of a vicious person. And therefore, the non-Jew rationalizes that they want to eat of the kosher species because they want to develop, they want to work on a refinement of their nature. So then the question is he allowed to learn the reasoning behind the mitzvah? I mean, obviously, if a non-Jew can do mitzvahs because of the logical reasoning, then it makes sense that he should be allowed to learn the logical reasoning of the mitzvah. And within the Jewish Torah study, there's different gradations as to what would be considered logical reasoning. There's a difference between something we might learn in the Keynote, which tends to be very logical reasons, that's different from what we might learn in a Maimorim. That's a very Kabbalistic reason for a mitzvah. They're really not the same area of study. So these definitions need to be developed better. so that we're able to function and do our study in a more dynamic manner. But within the basic framework of the divine code does hold. It's just it can be interpreted in many different ways as to how to implement this. And there's still two more dots. There's two more days for looking into the details of this. Thank you.